The man on the cliff edge had seen empires before. He had stood in the shadow of stone temples in central Mexico, watched the smoke of Tenochtitlan rise into the blue, walked through palaces where the floors were carved jade and the gods wore feathers, stolen from 1,000 miles of jungle. He had killed for those gods, and for the king of Spain, and for the metal in their teeth. He thought he knew what civilization looked like. He thought he could recognize it from a half-day's ride. And now on the morning of the 7th of July, in the year of our Lord 1540, Francisco Vásquez de Coronado sat on his Andalusian horse, dust on his beard, sweat darkening the leather of his saddle, and looked across the plain at something his mind refused to accept. Rising from the desert was a city. Stone walls, 4 stories tall, maybe 5, terraced like a staircase climbing into the blue, smoke from 100 ovens, women on the rooftops, ladders, everywhere, leaning against the upper levels like wooden vanes. He had been promised gold. He had crossed 2,000 miles of thirst and starvation and burning sand for the promise of gold. And what he saw instead was, in some ways, worse than disappointment. It was a contradiction. Because the people who lived in that city, the people who had quarried that sandstone, who had laid those walls plumb and true, who had raised those beams across spans no European mason could match without iron pulleys and wheeled carts, those people had no iron, no wheels, no oxen, no horses, no nails, no saws, no chisels of steel, no hammers harder than the sandstone they were striking. He looked at his men. His men looked at him, and one of them, a chronicler named Pedro de Castañeda, who would later write the only first-hand account of what happened next, leaned forward in his saddle and asked the question that would haunt Spanish minds for the next 300 years. How? How is this possible? The answer to that question is what this story is about, and it is stranger and older and more humbling than anything Castañeda could have imagined that morning. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you were a Spanish soldier in 1540, raised in a Europe where the wheel was assumed to be the foundation of any civilization worth the name, where iron was the measure of a kingdom's strength, where steel was the metal of God himself, what would you have thought, looking up at those walls? Would you have called it a miracle? Would you have called it a trick? Would you have called the men who built it lesser, because they had no metal, or greater, because they didn't seem to need it? Hold on to that thought. We'll come back to it, because the Spanish would spend the next 140 years trying to answer it, and most of them would get it wrong, and the few who got it right would be killed for saying so out loud. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you settle in, pour something, turn the lights down. This is a long story. It begins with a city in the sky, and it ends with a revolt that almost no one in your high school history book ever told you about. Stay with me. The desert that Coronado crossed to reach that first pueblo was, by his own account, the closest thing to hell he had ever experienced. 2.5 months of marching from Compostela in northern Mexico, through the Sonoran scrubland, up into the Mogollon Rim, across what is now Arizona, and into the western edge of New Mexico. He led, by the records of the expedition, somewhere between 300 and 350 European soldiers, around 1,000 allied warriors from central Mexico, and several thousand head of livestock, cattle, sheep, mules, horses. The horses were what gave the Spanish their reputation, the way the musket would give them their second. But out there in the high desert, the horses lost weight. The mules went lame. The sheep died in numbers no one bothered to count. Men ate their saddle leather. Men prayed for rain. Men deserted some and were never heard from again. And others were found weeks later, sun-blackened by parties sent back to recover the bodies. And all of them, every single one of them, marched toward what they had been told was a city of gold. They had been told this by a friar named Marcos de Niza, a Franciscan who had gone north a year earlier with a Moorish guide named Estevanico. Estevanico was killed at the first pueblo he tried to enter. Marcos saw the village from a hilltop at sunset, when the sandstone walls catch the last red light and seem to glow as though they were made of something else entirely. He went home and told the viceroy of New Spain that he had seen a city that rivaled Mexico, with houses of stone 4 and 5 stories high, and that the doorways were studded with turquoise like emeralds, and that the people wore cotton finer than Spain's. He wasn't entirely lying. The cotton part was true. The 4 and 5 stories was true. The turquoise on the doorways was true in some places, in some seasons, when offerings were left at thresholds. But the rest of it was the wishful thinking of a tired man who wanted to be the next Columbus and didn't want to admit he had run home before getting close enough to look. So when Coronado arrived, hungry, cracked at the lips, his cavalry reduced to skin over ribs, and he saw the pueblo of Hawiku on the horizon and realized that the houses were not gold but mud and stone, the rage that came over him is preserved in his own letter to the viceroy. He wrote that the friar had not told the truth in a single thing he had said. Not a single thing. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because that rage was about gold. It was about what the city wasn't. It wasn't yet about what the city was. That came slower, that came in pieces over the next several months as Coronado's men, hungry and cold and stranded in a winter they had not packed for, were forced to actually live inside one of these places, to sleep in the rooms, to climb the ladders, to touch the walls in the dark. And what they discovered, slowly, room by room, terrace by terrace, was that the people they had just declared the property of the King of Spain were better builders than they were, by a margin that hurt to admit. Let me explain what I mean. The walls of Hoiku and of the dozen or so pueblos that the Spanish would visit over the next 2 years were not piled rubble. They were not earth thrown together with hope. They were courses of dressed sandstone, shaped to fit, set in mud mortar, and finished on the outside with a coat of plaster so smooth that Castañeda compared it to the walls of houses in Granada. The corners were square. The doorways were linteled with peeled timbers cut to the inch. The roofs were supported by ponderosa pine beams called vigas, some of them more than 15 feet long, hauled in from mountains 40, 50, in some cases over 60 miles away, by people who had no wagons, no oxen, no iron axes, no saws. The Spanish soldiers, some of whom had worked stone in their youth in Castile or Andalusia, would walk along these walls and run their hands over the joints and shake their heads, because they could feel the precision of it. They could feel that someone, generations of someones, had figured out how to do this work without any of the tools the Spaniard considered essential to the craft. And the question kept coming back. How? The honest answer, the one we now know, the one those Spanish soldiers would not have wanted to hear, is that the Pueblo people had been doing this for longer than Spain had been a country. Coronado was looking at the descendants of a building tradition that stretched back 9, maybe 10 centuries before his arrival, long before there was a Madrid, long before there was a Holy Roman Empire, long before the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela had laid its first stone. People had been raising multi-story masonry buildings on this plateau, learning, refining, passing the technique down from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son, the way a Castilian family passed down a sword. Their tools were not iron. Their tools were sandstone hammerstones, hafted to wooden handles with rawhide, used to dress softer sandstone into building blocks. Their tools were antler picks for prying flakes off larger pieces. Their tools were wooden trowels, smoothed and worn, used for plastering. Their tools were their hands, their backs, their knees, calloused from a lifetime of kneeling on rooftops mixing adobe. And their tools, above all, were time and patience and a kind of communal labor that Spain had largely forgotten by the 16th century. A wall at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, hundreds of years before Coronado, had been built one course at a time by dozens of people working together, returning year after year, generation after generation. There was no overseer, there was no foreman. There were only the people who needed the wall and the people who knew how to build it, and the long, slow, deliberate process of remembering how it had been done last time and doing it again, slightly better. The Spanish had no category for this kind of work. They came from a world of guilds and contracts, a world where the master mason held the secrets and his apprentices paid for the privilege of standing nearby. The Pueblos had no master masons in that sense. The knowledge belonged to everyone, or more precisely, the knowledge belonged to the women, and that was something Castañeda noticed too, and could barely bring himself to write down. Take a breath here, because we are going to slow down and look closely at one of these places, not just walk past it on the way to a battle. The Pueblo we know best, because it still exists, because people still live there, because you can drive a paved road today to within a few hundred yards of its walls, is called Acoma. The Spanish wrote it many ways. Acuco, Acoma, Hacus. The Acoma people themselves call it Haku. It sits on top of a sandstone mesa, 365 feet above the desert floor, and it has been continuously inhabited by oral tradition for at least 900 years, and possibly longer than 1,000. That is older than every cathedral in Europe. That is older than the country of Portugal. That is older than the words Castilian and Aragonese meaning anything to each other. When Coronado's lieutenant, a man named Hernando de Alvarado, climbed the trail to Acoma in the autumn of 1540, he reported back that the city was the most defensive position he had ever seen in his life. The only way up was a stone staircase carved directly into the cliff face, and at certain points, the staircase narrowed to a single vertical chimney, where a man had to put his hands and feet into hollows worn smooth by centuries of climbing. Centuries. Think about that for a moment. The handholds at Acoma were not chiseled. They were worn. They were rounded by the touch of human skin over so long a period that the rock itself had given way. Alvarado wrote that he was not certain his men, in armor, could climb it at all, and yet the Acoma people climbed it daily, carrying water from the cisterns at the base, carrying firewood up from the valleys, carrying, when the time came, the great ponderosa pine beams cut from Mount Taylor, 40 miles to the north, beams that weighed, in some cases, 600 pounds. They carried them up that staircase, on their backs, with ropes braided from yucca fiber, without dropping them, without breaking them, without losing a single one in 9 centuries of construction. Now, I want to pause and tell you something that researchers at the University of Colorado in Boulder figured out only a few years ago, because for a long time, archaeologists assumed that the great Pueblo timbers, especially the ones at Chaco Canyon, were carried in teams of 4 or 6 men, hands gripping the wood, walking sideways. They assumed this because that is how a European would do it. But when they actually tried to measure the ancient roads at Chaco, the engineering professor leading the study realized something. The roads were too wide for that. The roads were 30 feet wide. You don't need a 30-foot road for 4 men carrying a log. You need it for something else. They tested a different theory, a technique called the tump line. A tump line is a strap that goes across the forehead, with the load hanging down the back. It distributes the weight along the spine, the way some Andean peoples still do, the way Sherpas in Nepal still do, the way porters all over the world still move heavy loads on foot. 2 people, with tump lines, walking single file, the log balanced on their backs, can carry that 600-pound timber 60 miles with rest stops in a way that no 4-person crew can. And that is, the researchers concluded, almost certainly how it was done. 2 people, a strap, a road built wider than necessary to give them margin, and a knowledge of the body and the path that no Spanish engineer in 1540 had ever even considered as a possibility. The conquistadors stood looking at those beams in the ceiling of a Pueblo room and could not, in their imagination, picture how the wood had gotten there. So they invented stories. Some said demons had brought the timbers. Some said the natives had once had iron and lost it. Some, in the years that followed, would whisper that the Pueblos had been built by another race entirely, a race of giants long vanished, and that the people now living in them were squatters who had merely inherited the walls. Every one of those stories was wrong. The walls had been built by the great-grandmothers of the women who were, at that very moment, kneading bread in the ovens at the base of those very walls. If you've been listening this far, and the story's hitting you the way it hits me, take a second to drop a comment below. Tell me where you're from. Tell me what part of this is making you stop and think. I read everyone. If this channel is the kind of history you want more of, hit the subscribe button before you forget. We have a lot more of these coming. Now back to it. Because we still haven't answered the central question. How did people without iron tools shape sandstone into perfect blocks? How did they cut beams to length? How did they bore holes for the wooden pegs that held everything together? The answer is in the rock itself. Sandstone, the local stone of the Colorado Plateau, has a property that Europeans, accustomed to harder building stones like granite or limestone, did not initially appreciate. Sandstone is soft. It splits along bedding planes. If you strike it with another stone, especially a denser stone like a stream cobble of basalt or quartzite, it will flake, predictably, in the same direction, every time. The Pueblo Masons knew this. They had been studying sandstone for 10 generations. They knew which quarries produced which colors, which beds split clean, which beds shattered, which stones needed to age in the open air for a season before they were ready to dress. They worked the rock with hammerstones the size of a fist, and they knew exactly where to strike. A skilled mason at Chaco Canyon could shape a block of sandstone, square and true on all 6 faces, in the time it took a Spanish stonecutter to lay out his iron chisel and his mallet and pick a place to start. The Pueblo Mason was not faster because he was cleverer. He was faster because his ancestors had been doing this for 900 years and had passed the knowledge down so thoroughly that the work had become muscle memory. The same was true of timber. The Pueblos did not chop a tree the way a Spanish woodsman did, with a steel axe at the trunk. They burned it, or rather, they burned a controlled ring around the base of the tree, watched it weaken over a season, and then pushed it down with leverage. Then they burned the trunk into segments at the lengths they needed. Burned, not cut. The blackened ends of pine beams in old Pueblo ceilings dating from before 1400 still show the carbonization pattern. They looked like they were sawn. They were not sawn. They were slowly, patiently, accurately cooked into shape. There is one more piece of the technique that I want you to understand because it's the piece that, more than any other, frustrated the Spanish into outright disbelief. And that is the question of water. Acoma sits on top of a mesa. There is no spring on top of that mesa. There is no well that goes down through 365 feet of solid sandstone. So how did the people of Acoma, for 900 years, get water to the top? The answer is that they didn't. The water came up by itself. The Acoma people had identified, generations earlier, 2 natural depressions in the sandstone of the mesa top, 2 shallow basins where the rock dipped slightly inward. They had built up the lips of those basins with mortared stone, gradually, over decades, until they had created cisterns, reservoirs, catchments that filled not from below but from above. Every summer when the monsoon storms broke over Mount Taylor, the rain that fell on the mesa top did not run off. It ran toward the cisterns. The Acoma had shaped the surface of the rock itself, in some places by removing high spots, in others by raising low ridges, so that every drop of rain that fell on 100 or more square yards of sandstone was directed, by gravity, toward those two basins. The cisterns held enough water in a normal monsoon year to sustain the village through the dry winter and the long, hot months of late spring. They had been doing this since before there was a Spain. They had been doing this since before there was an England. The Spaniards, when they arrived, watched the village fill its cisterns and could barely process what they were seeing. They were used to wells. They were used to aqueducts, the great Roman channels that still ran in parts of southern Spain. They had no concept of catchment harvesting on a domestic scale, because in Andalusia and Castile and the country they had come from, you didn't need it. The rain came often enough that you could just dig down and find it. Here, in the high desert, you had to think backwards. You had to think upward. You had to invite the sky to give you what the ground refused to. The Acoma had learned to do this. The Spanish never quite did. There are records, from the early 17th century, of Spanish settlers in New Mexico starving for water in dry years, while the pueblos a few miles away had cisterns full to the brim because they had spent generations preparing for exactly that kind of year. The Spanish wrote some of this down with a kind of grudging admiration. They wrote some of it down without admiration at all, simply as fact, and the fact spoke for itself. I should also tell you, before we move on, about the kivas. Because the kivas are the part of Pueblo architecture that the Spanish noticed most, and understood least, and feared the most. A kiva is a room, usually circular in the older pueblos, usually rectangular at Acoma, almost always partly underground, accessed by a ladder from a small opening in the ceiling, the same kind of ladder that gave the pueblos their defensive entrances. The walls of a kiva are plastered. The floor is hard-packed earth. There is, in the floor, a small round hole a few inches across called a sipapu. The sipapu represents, in Pueblo cosmology, the place where humanity emerged from the earth at the beginning of the world. It is the spiritual axis of the room. It is the spiritual axis, in some sense, of the entire community. The kiva is where men, mostly gathered for ceremonies. It is where the masked figures of the kachina dances were prepared. It is where the prayers for rain were spoken. It is where the next generation of men, at the right age, were brought to learn what they needed to know about being adult members of a Pueblo society. The friars, when they understood what the kivas were, ordered them filled in, burned, destroyed. They saw them as temples to false gods. The Pueblo people, when ordered to destroy their own kivas, did so, in some cases, slowly. They poured a little dirt in each year. They claimed the construction was unsafe. They begged for time. And underneath, in many cases, in the floor of an outwardly destroyed kiva, the sipapu was carefully preserved. A small, secret hole in the dirt, the spiritual heart of the community, hidden beneath a layer of soil that the friars walked over without noticing. This, more than anything else, is what the Spanish failed to understand. They thought they were bringing a god to a people who had none. The people had several. The people had been talking to those gods in those rooms for 900 years. And the people, very simply, were not going to stop, no matter what the friars said. The Spanish, watching all this, did not write much of it down, because what they were writing down was the gold count, which was 0, the silver count, which was 0, the slaves they could acquire, which was a number Coronado kept revising upward as winter set in. They were not writing an architectural treatise, but they were observing, and they were absorbing, and certain things made their way back into the record. Castañeda noted that the women of the pueblos did all the building. The men hunted and farmed and went to war, but the houses were built by women, repaired by women, replastered every summer by women, and that the houses, as a result, were considered the property of women. A man who married moved into his wife's family's house. He brought his blanket and his bow and very little else. The walls were not his. The walls had been built by his mother-in-law, or his wife's mother's mother, or some great-grandmother further back than anyone could remember. This horrified Castañeda. He spent more ink describing this arrangement than he did the size of the buildings, because to a Spanish mind in 1540, a woman who owned a house was almost as strange as a city built without iron. He describes the women working on the rooftops in summer, wet adobe up to their elbows, smoothing the new layer over the old, while the men sat below and ground corn or tended to the daily chores. He couldn't decide if it was admirable or scandalous or evidence of some demonic inversion of natural order, so he wrote it as fact and let his readers in Spain figure out what to do with it, and his readers mostly ignored him. I want to walk you through a single building, now, in detail, the way the Spanish would have walked through it, so that you can feel what they felt. Imagine you are a soldier under Coronado, sometime in the winter of 1540, billeted in a captured pueblo near what is today Bernalillo, New Mexico. The Spaniards have evicted the inhabitants. Castañeda's exact phrase was that the original residents took nothing but themselves and the clothes they were wearing. You walk into the building. The first thing you notice is the smell. Not bad. pine smoke and cornmeal, and the slightly sweet animal smell of well-cured leather. The walls are warm, even in winter, even when the wind outside is cutting. They are warm because they face south, and because they are thick, perhaps 2 feet at the base, and because they have been absorbing sun all day and are now, in the evening, releasing it slowly into the room. Above you, the ceiling is a layer of round pine beams, vigas, peeled and oiled and dark with age. Across them are smaller poles, latillas in herringbone patterns. Above the latillas, a layer of brush. Above the brush, a layer of packed earth. The roof is also the floor of the room above, where someone, before the Spanish came, used to sleep. The walls are plastered smooth and painted in some rooms, with white earth, in some with red, in some with patterns of black geometric design that resemble nothing the Spanish have ever seen. The doorways are low, T-shaped, narrower at the bottom than the top. You have to duck. You have to turn sideways. The Spanish soldier finds this insulting until someone explains to him that the shape is a defensive feature. An attacker has to come through it slowly, one shoulder at a time. The defender on the other side has all the advantage. There are no windows at ground level. There were never windows at ground level. The lower floors of a pueblo were originally accessible only by ladder from above, and the ladders could be pulled up at night. The whole building, 4 or 5 stories tall, was a fortress disguised as a home, and the Spanish soldier lying on a sleeping mat that night, in a room built without iron, by women on the foundation of older rooms built by older women, rooms whose plaster had been renewed every summer for 3 centuries, and which were warmer and drier and quieter than the stone houses he had grown up in back in Andalusia, lying there. That soldier had to confront something. He had been told these people were barbarians. He had been told the King of Spain was bringing them civilization. And the room he was sleeping in was, in many measurable ways, a more thoughtful piece of architecture than the one his own mother had raised him in. He didn't write that down. None of them did. But you can read it between the lines. You can read it in the things they kept noticing and could not stop describing. The 7-story buildings, the plastered walls, the terraced layouts, the fact that a pueblo town in the freezing high desert winter was warmer than a Spanish stockade. There is a moment in Castañeda's account that I keep coming back to. He is describing the layout of a typical pueblo, and he writes that the houses are arranged in such a way that the south-facing walls catch the winter sun, and that the buildings rise toward the north, like a great staircase, so that no row of houses casts shadow on the row in front of it. He doesn't fully understand what he is seeing. He doesn't have the vocabulary. He doesn't know the term passive solar. That term would not exist in any human language for another 400 years. But he is describing it. He is describing in 1540 an architectural principle that 20th century engineers in 1978 would model with computers and conclude was extraordinarily efficient. A team from the University of Southern California, led by a researcher named Ralph Knowles, did this study at Acoma in the late 1970s. They took the same building plan and ran it through their solar simulation software. They concluded that the pueblo design captured something in the order of 40 to 50% of available winter sunlight as usable interior heat, while reflecting summer sun away. They published the results. They were impressed. They had no easy way to communicate in their academic language the fact that they had just confirmed with a computer what an unnamed Acoma woman, kneading adobe on a rooftop in the year 1200, had already known in her hands and her bones, and the way her grandmother had taught her to lay out a floor plan. We need to talk about Juan de Oñate now, because the story has to turn dark, and Oñate is where it turns. Coronado, in the end, gave up on the pueblos. He found no gold, no silver, no kingdom. He marched east into the Great Plains, lured by a captive Plains Indian known to the Spanish as the Turk, who told him there was a city of gold called Quivira just a little farther on. There was no city of gold. The Turk was, by some accounts, deliberately leading the Spanish to their deaths in the open prairie, hoping they would die of thirst before they could hurt anyone else. They didn't die, but they didn't find anything. Coronado returned to Mexico in 1542 with nothing to show, fell from his horse on the journey back, and never fully recovered, just as the soothsayer in Salamanca had predicted before the expedition began. He died a broken man. The pueblos were left mostly alone for the next 56 years. The Spanish crown lost interest. The reports came back negative. There was nothing there worth taking. And in those 56 years, the Pueblo people, the Acoma, the Zuni, the Hopi, the dozens of communities along the Rio Grande, went back to their lives. They rebuilt the houses Coronado had damaged. They replanted the corn his livestock had trampled. They told their descendants stories about the strange men in shells of metal, the men who were terrified of ladders, the men who had asked over and over where the gold was, and could not seem to understand the answer that there was no gold, that there had never been gold, that the gold the Spanish wanted had only ever existed in the dreams of a starving friar. And then, in 1598, Juan de Oñate arrived. Oñate was not a soldier of fortune in the Coronado mold. He was something colder and more dangerous. He was a colonizer. He had been authorized by the King of Spain to establish permanent settlements. He brought 130 soldiers, 400 colonists, 83 wagons, and 7,000 head of livestock. He was not coming to find gold. He was coming to stay, and he wanted the Pueblos as a workforce. What happened at Acoma in the December of 1598 is one of those events the Spanish records describe at length, and the Acoma records, oral, generational, transmitted in songs and at certain ceremonies, describe almost not at all. There is a reason for that. The reason is that what happened was so terrible that the Acoma people made a decision, collectively, in the years afterward, to stop describing it in detail, because to describe it was to relive it, and the survivors did not want the generations that came after them to carry that weight. Here is the outline. A small Spanish detachment, led by Oñate's nephew, climbed the mesa in early December asking for supplies. There was a confrontation. The details are disputed. By all surviving accounts, the Acoma killed Oñate's nephew and most of his men. By Acoma tradition, the Spanish had committed offenses, demands, takings that triggered the response. By Spanish chronicle, the killings were treacherous. We will probably never know with certainty which version is closer to truth. What is not disputed is what came next. Oñate sent a punitive expedition under his lieutenant Vicente de Zaldivar. They besieged Acoma for 3 days in late January of 1599. The Spanish, against all odds, hauled a small cannon to the top of an adjacent mesa and fired into the village. They breached the defenses. By the surviving Spanish records, around 800 Acoma people died in the assault. The mesa-top village, the village that had stood for centuries, was burned. And then, when the survivors had been gathered, Oñate held a trial. He sentenced every Acoma man over the age of 25 to have 1 foot cut off, and to 20 years of forced servitude. The sentence was, in some cases, carried out. In others, the punishment was commuted to slavery alone. We know this from Oñate's own dispatches, which he wrote in his own hand, in ink, on paper, in a spirit of professional accounting, as though he were tallying livestock. The Spanish crown eventually recalled Oñate. He was tried, in Mexico City, for cruelty exceeding the bounds even of conquest, and he was found guilty, and he was banished from New Mexico for life. But the damage was done. The Acoma rebuilt. They always did. They climbed back up the staircase to their burned mesa, and they began, course by course, to put the walls back together. Here is what nobody told you in school. The Pueblos rose, not in 1599, but later, slowly, over generations. The Spanish set up missions. They built churches. They demanded labor. They forced the construction of San Esteban del Rey at Acoma between 1629 and 1641. By the records of Acoma oral tradition and Spanish dispatches alike, 168 Acoma people died building that church. 20,000 tons of adobe, sandstone, and ponderosa pine were carried up that staircase, the same staircase, by the women and the elderly and whoever could be made to lift the load. The men, mostly, were sent 40 miles away to Mount Taylor to cut and carry the beams, by hand, with tumplines, the same way their ancestors had done it, except now they were not doing it for themselves. They were doing it for a god they had not asked for. The friars, meanwhile, banned the kachina dances. They burned the kivas, the underground ceremonial chambers where, for 900 years, the Pueblo people had communicated with the spirits of their ancestors. The friars whipped grown men who continued to practice the old religion. They confiscated the prayer sticks. They told the people, in language that was meant to be merciful but landed as something else, that everything their grandparents had ever believed was a lie. And the people listened and smiled and did not argue, and kept the kachina dances going in secret, in caves and remote canyons, in the pre-dawn hours when the friars were still asleep. They had been hiding things from outsiders for a long time. They knew how. And in 1675, after almost 80 years of this slow, grinding pressure, a man named Popeye from San Juan Pueblo was arrested by the Spanish authorities along with 46 other Pueblo religious leaders. 3 of them were hanged. The rest, including Popeye, were whipped and released. He went home. He went into a kiva. He stayed there for almost 5 years. And what he did in those years would change the history of the Spanish Empire in North America. If you have been with me this whole time, I am grateful. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already, because what comes next is the part of this story you have probably never heard. Popeye is not in most American history books. He is barely in some New Mexico history books. But what he organized, in absolute secrecy, across more than a dozen separate pueblos that spoke different languages, that had not always been allies, that had centuries of their own internal tensions, was one of the most successful indigenous resistance movements ever recorded in the Americas. He did it without writing. There were no letters. There were no maps. There were no signed orders. Everything was carried by runners, who memorized the dates, who memorized the codes, who carried knotted cords, similar in concept to the Inca quipu, where each knot represented a day. The plan was simple. On a single day, every pueblo, simultaneously from Taos in the north to the Hopi villages in the west, would rise and drive the Spanish from their territory, burn the churches, tear down the missions, push the survivors south past El Paso out of the land entirely. The Spanish were not to be allowed to escape with anything, not even with the Christianity they had brought. Pope even ordered that the Pueblo people who had been baptized must wash themselves in the rivers, in yucca soap, to remove the memory of the holy water from their skin. The date was August 13th of 1680. But 2 of the runners were captured. The Spanish governor in Santa Fe, a man named Antonio de Otermin, learned that something was coming. He just didn't know exactly what, or when, or how big. Pope, hearing about the captures, moved up the date. The revolt began on August 10th. What happened in those days, between the 10th and the 21st of August, is the largest indigenous victory ever achieved on the territory of what would become the United States. By the time it was over, 400 Spanish settlers were dead, including 21 of the 33 Franciscan friars in New Mexico. Otermin himself, wounded, his palace burned, retreated to Santa Fe, and, after a 9-day siege in which the Pueblo warriors cut off his water supply, was forced to abandon the capital and lead the surviving Spanish, 2,000 of them, men, women, families, slaves, livestock, on a long, ragged retreat south to El Paso. They left behind, by the inventory taken later, almost everything: their books, their wagons, their statues, their wine cellars, the bell of the Church of San Miguel, the records of 80 years of mission work. The Spanish would not return to New Mexico for 12 years, and when they did return, in 1692, under a different governor, Diego de Vargas, they returned with very different orders. They were told, in writing by the Spanish crown, to be more careful this time, to respect the kivas, to allow the kachina dances, to stop whipping people for the practice of the old religion, to stop, in short, trying to break a culture that, on the evidence of August 10th of 1680, could not be broken. The Pueblos did not get everything they wanted. The Spanish came back. The missions, in modified form, were re-established. But something had changed. The pressure was reduced. The forced labor was scaled back. The kachina dances were left alone, officially more or less, with occasional exceptions. And the Pueblos, in their adobe walls and their multi-story buildings and their plastered ceilings, continued to exist. They are still there. You can drive there tomorrow if you wanted to. I want to come back now to the question I asked at the beginning, the question Coronado's chronicler asked, sitting on his horse looking at the walls of Hawiku on the morning of the 7th of July of 1540. How? How is this possible? The answer, the real answer, is that the Spanish were asking the wrong question. They were asking how a city could have been built without iron, as if iron were the prerequisite of civilization. The Pueblo people, if anyone had thought to ask them, would have answered something like this: we did not need iron because we had what was already there. We had sandstone that splits along its bedding plains. We had streams full of cobbles that are harder than sandstone. We had antler from the deer we hunted. We had pine from the mountains that we could fell with patient fire. We had yucca fiber for ropes. We had buffalo hide for sacks. We had clay for adobe and straw for binder. And our own backs and our own hands, and 900 years of grandmothers teaching their granddaughters what their grandmothers had taught them. We had something the Spanish, in all their iron and all their gunpowder, did not have. We had a relationship with this place that was older than memory. We knew which clay made the best plaster. We knew which trees, on which slopes, gave the longest beams. We knew when the monsoons came and when the cisterns would fill, and when the corn could go in the ground, and when the deer would come down from the high country. We did not build this city against the land. We built it with the land, and the land, in return, kept us. The conquistadors did not understand any of this. They were looking for the wrong thing. They were trained to recognize gold and silver in palaces of cut stone with vaulted ceilings, the trappings of empires they had crushed in Mexico and Peru. They walked past, every day, in the dust of Hawiku and Acoma and the Tiguex Pueblos, an architecture older than Spain. They walked past it, complaining of the cold, complaining of the food, complaining that there was nothing of value in this country. And the Pueblo people watched them, fed them out of obligation, hid their cachinas, kept their walls in repair, and waited. The Spanish would leave eventually, the elders told the younger ones. The walls would still be here when they did. And the elders were right. Coronado is dust. Oñate is a name on a few historical markers, some of them now defaced. The Spanish Empire in North America is a memory. The Pueblos are still standing. The same plaster on the same walls, replaced in layers every summer by the women, just as it has been since before the printing press was invented in Europe, just as it has been since before the founding of Moscow, just as it has been, more or less, since the year the Pueblo people moved onto these mesas and decided that this was the place that had been prepared for them. I want to leave you with one more image, because I have been thinking about it on and off for the last few weeks while I was reading for this story. There is a feast day at Acoma every year on the 2nd of September. It is the feast of St. Stephen, San Esteban, the Catholic saint to whom the church on the mesa is dedicated, the church that 168 Acoma people died building. On that day, the Acoma opened the village to visitors. Tribal members come back from wherever they are now living, from Albuquerque, from Phoenix, from California, from wherever the modern world has scattered them. They climb the mesa. They eat at the homes of their relatives. The dancers come out. They dance in the plaza in front of the church, in the same dust where their great-great-grandparents danced before there was a church, before there was a Spaniard, before there was an iron tool within 1,000 miles of the place. And the dance is not bitter. That is what people who have visited come back saying, almost more than anything else. The dance is not bitter. It is not a protest. It is not a memorial. It is a continuation. It is simply what the Acoma people do. They have been doing it longer than most countries have existed. They will be doing it after most countries have ceased to exist. The walls behind the dancers were not built with iron. The roof of the church above them was carried on the backs of women who, by oral tradition, knew the names of every grandmother who had ever set a stone in the village. They built without iron, and they built without wheels, and they built without writing. And what they built has outlasted everything the people with iron and wheels and writing came here to take. Castañeda, riding back to Mexico in 1542, weak from cold and hunger and disappointment, tried, in the years that followed, to make sense of what he had seen. He wrote his account in the years before his death. He apologized in the introduction for any errors of memory. He wrote that he was not a learned man. He wrote that he wanted to leave a record, however imperfect, of distant places that the people of Spain knew almost nothing about. And toward the end of his account, paraphrased into modern English, because the original lay buried for centuries in a manuscript that nobody bothered to print until long after his death, he wrote that the people of those distant pueblos had built houses that, if a man stood in them in winter, with the doors closed and the fires lit, that man would not believe he was in a barbarous country. That man, said Castañeda, would believe he had walked into the home of a king? Maybe he had. Maybe that's what the Spanish never understood. The people of the pueblos were not subjects waiting to be civilized. They were already living in the houses of kings. The kings had simply decided, generations earlier, that the houses belonged to everyone, and that the wealth was the walls themselves, and that the walls would be rebuilt every summer by every grandmother until the world ended. If this story moved you, if it made you stop and think about what civilization actually is, who actually has it, who has had it the longest, do me one favor. Share this with someone, anyone, a friend, a parent, a history teacher, a stranger online. The pueblos are still there. The dance is still happening. The walls are still being replastered. And the more people who know that, the harder it becomes to forget. I'll see you in the next one.